All right, y'all, we are wrapping up the first unit in English 552, and you've read three of the most ambitious, most commonly cited, most critically acclaimed comic books in the history of Western comics: Mouse, Dark Knight Return, and Watchmen. These are what I'm calling the big three, and they form the nucleus of this Annum Mirabilis, or this miracle year from 1986 to 1987. And these comics not only transformed the landscape of comics in the 90s, 2000s, and even into today, but they also kind of coalesced certain movements that were happening in comics throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I don't want you to think that these comics came out of nowhere. Of course they didn't. They participated in a kind of long history of comics that certain material and ideological conditions made these comics possible in 86 and 87, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So in 86, 87, times were changing. There was a robust, what's called comics, you'll notice the X at the end of that word, movement in the 70s primarily, which were underground comics, not associated with the big two publishers, with Marvel or DC or even Archie or anything like that. Often self-published fanzines, Z-I-N-E, that sort of culture that were made by individual artists or collectives. And that's where Art Spiegelman's work comes from, is that movement. They were often associated with more introspective issues. They were associated with avant-garde art. So they were in a different tradition than most of the books we're reading. But I bring this up because they were the sorts of things that people like Alan Moore, Art Spiegelman, and Klaus Janson and Frank Miller would have been reading and aware of. And they took comics and brought in a kind of psychological, artistic bent that really gets fully exploited, I think, in the mainstream, at least, in comics like Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and Mouse. Another thing that's really important is the Comics Code, which you'll see over here. If you bought comics anywhere up to 2011, really, you might have seen this image in the upper right-hand corner of the comic. So the Comics Code Authority, was established in 1954 and designed as a self-policing tool. That there were a lot of people concerned about the impact that comics were having on young people. They thought they were turning young people into delinquents and all sorts of nonsense. And rather than have governmental interference, what these comics companies did was construct this Comic Code Authority, or the CCA, that had certain rules, and I'll look at those rules in the next slide. And comics would have to voluntarily abide by those rules, or else they couldn't put this approved by the Comics Code Authority sign on their comics. And this was a kind of selling point for some parents and organizations that were worried about the content of comics. So the decline of the Comics Code happens in the 80s, and indeed, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing in 1984 was the first comic to abandon the CCA. They did not seek the CCA's. They did not try to get this sign on their comic. They didn't even submit it for approval by the CCA. And the CCA was still in existence until 2011. Marvel opted out of it in 2001. DC opted out in 2011. So it was remarkably long-lived, 67 years. I'm not good at math, I'm an English professor, but it was around from 1954 to 2011, and really conditioned a lot of what could go into a comic. That started to fall by the wayside in the mid-'80s, and obviously Watchmen and comics like that did not get the CCA code of approval, stamp of approval. Something also happened in the 70s where we transitioned from a newsstand model to a direct market sales model for comics. So it was once upon a time that you would have to go to a supermarket or corner store or something like that to get your comics. In the 70s, they started a direct market model or direct sales model that led to the rise of comic book shops, which we still have all over Louisville to this day. Your local brick and mortar shop that you could go browse comics, buy individual comics, had a lot more options, and you met other people who were also into comics, and you were able to kind of cultivate an interest in comics and also learn about new comics through the people that went there. And there was a shift to adult consumers at this point too, because the people who had grown up reading comics that came out in the 60s and the 70s, in the golden silver age of comics, grew up reading these comics and as adults still wanted to read them. So if you were somebody who was 25 or 26 in 1986, 87 and grown up reading comics, all of a sudden there were comics that were more adult. They were geared towards more sophisticated issues. And we get things like Art Spiegelman's Arcade, which was a short-lived comics magazine that he put out between 75 and 76. Get Frank Miller's run on Daredevil. He started drawing there in 79, but started becoming the lead writer in 81. And then Alan Moore's Saga the Swamp Thing in 84. These were three comics by each of the big three authors that we can see as kind of landmark changes in the depth, the psychology, and the kind of adult content of comics. So here's some of the comics code. I don't know why it goes 12, 11, 12. I don't know. I just kind of excerpted these. That about crime shall never be presented in such way as to create sympathy for the criminal. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. There's no nudity. Subjective and salacious illustration is unacceptable. There's a bunch of these things that really made comics really hamstrung a lot of what you could put into a comic. And obviously, these are the sorts of things that if mainstream comics were abiding by these, Watchmen was a big deviation from that. So as these kids grow up reading comics that were produced under the CCA, and they see the CCA kind of go by the sidelines, and comics take on a more adult, more sophisticated, to darker, grittier tone, that's something that allowed the kids to kind of grow up as the form matured. So many of the comics of this period have a kind of thematic realism, or that they're texts that reflect more real-world issues. We can definitely see that in the concern about nuclear war and DKR and Watchmen, for example. And also iconic realism, artistic styles that shift towards realism much more. Of course, comics had always been sort of realistic, but my point is that the kind of form matured in this point and how they depicted things and the level of realism that they incorporated in both the themes that they treated and also how they rendered those visually in the artistic styles. And in this point, we also get a slight increase in diversity of characters. It still remains the world of white males, of course, but there become more women in lead roles, more depictions of minorities than had been there previous. And something that also happens is we get films in this period like it's the Superman movie. The first one in 1978 with Christopher Reeve, Marlon Brando, Gene Hackman was a great commercial success. And around this time, we also have Star Wars, films like Jaws. You get fantasy, sci-fi, comics kind of coming to a head, coming into their own and getting much more kind of widespread commercial viability, which creates a kind of culture in which comics can enjoy some economic success. We're seeing a very similar thing now, particularly with all the Marvel movies. You can make somebody who's teaching a class on comics in 20 years is going to have this slide about the 2010s and the Marvel franchise, I'm sure. So for Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen in particular, this kind of realism reflects social anxieties such as nuclear war, as I said, and it also really thinks about heroes and their flaws. So when the Comics Code Authority refused to investigate the darker side of comics, the darker side of heroism, the darker side of criminality, Watchmen and DKR kind of take that up as central thematic concerns, central questions they want to ask, and it becomes almost meta commentaries on the history of comics and on graphic novels and heroism more broadly. We also get comics here that want to test the formal limits, and we see this in Watchmen in chapters 4 and 5, for example, where chapter 4 I think plays with how comics work as a spatio-temporal form, or as the form of comics is tied to time. As you move forward in space, you're also moving forward in time, and I think Dr. Manhattan's playing with that. And then in chapter the Fearful Symmetry chapter, we get Moore and Gibbons kind of playing with how symmetry might work in a comic, and in such a way that you can't reproduce that in other forms or other media like traditional print novels and film. And we also get a kind of update of established characters like Dark Knight Returns. Batman gets a kind of slightly different take on his origin story. He's 55 years old. We get much more kind of playful investigation, and we get these that are really kind of aimed at adult audiences. And a few ways we see this is in Dark Knight Returns, for example. One of the most brilliant parts of this is a little throwaway moment you may not have gotten, where Batman gets shot in the chest, and he explains, why do you think I wear a target on my chest? Can't armor my head, left arm numb, right? So it never made sense that Batman would have this bright yellow symbol in his chest. So Frank Miller finds a way to make it realistic. He's trying to get shot there because it's Kevlar loaded and can provide some kind of bulletproof resistance. We also get Rorschach's shoes, right? Hey, his shoes, they got pads. The Runt wears elevator shoes. So Rorschach is not the tallest guy, and he wears lifts in his shoes. And I think these are just two small moments that demonstrate some of the things I'm talking about, that we get characters who are obviously less than perfect, particularly in Rorschach's case, but investigating what a hero might look like in real life and what might motivate that hero in real life. I would be remiss, too, if I didn't talk quickly about Sandman, which was a comic by Neil Gaiman. It is a little later, starts in 89 and gets taken over in 93 by the Wildstorm imprint of, the Vertigo imprint of DC. So it begins in DC in 89, but it becomes part of Vertigo. And Vertigo is really important because it's a branch of DC that's aimed particularly at adult audiences. It has no affiliation with the Comics Code Authority, and it's really kind of propelled forward by Saga of Swamp Thing, by Dark Knight Returns, and by Watchmen and Sandman. These are four comics that DC, through which DC realizes there's a robust adult market for comics that wants these more grown-up books. And Sandman is really great. There's a recent Audible adaptation. It sounds weird to have a comic on Audible, but it works and it's awesome. I know Gabriel doesn't like it, but he's wrong about that. It's awesome. Just kidding. But not. It's very literary, this text, and mythopoetic, or it's trying to create mythology. If you're familiar with Gaiman's work, he also writes one called American Gods, which there's a live-action version of that, too, on some platform. And it gets really experimental with panels. You can't quite see it here, but the strict panel, the linear kind of panels break down in Gaiman's work a lot. When we get to Mouse, though, Mouse injects into the development of comics a gritty historical or autobiographical realism, but it's stylized, right? And I think we talked about this in some of our posts, but Spiegelman couldn't just render these as humans. Like, the conceit of mice and cats and dogs has its problems in essentializing difference and essentializing racial and ethnic and national categories. That's true. But it also kind of softens through that stylization the images and the trauma being depicted, so that it's kind of regular audiences kind of take it in and can process it, right? So image text form creates opportunities also for bearing witness. Like, even though it's stylized, we are bearing witness to these historical events. And it also brings in really kind of robust opportunities for investigating biography, memoir, photography, and trauma in comics that we'll investigate through Persepolis and Nat Turner and Displacement this semester. So Mouse is kind of revisionist in that it incorporates elements of documentary, of that kind of film trajectory. You can see this here where we get the kind of depiction of the bunker, draws attention to the real world, gets much more iconic or realistic, and also investigates the formal boundaries of comics, right? So this almost seems like a panel, even though it's just a notepad, and it becomes part of the narrative because it's about bearing witness. Like, this is, I think, Art Spiegelman showing us there's realism behind what I'm doing here. And I just love this panel so much, this page so much. This is from the second Mouse, which we didn't read, but I encourage you to read, where he really talks about what comics can do, right? He says, I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams and trying to do it in a comic strip. I guess a bit off more than I could chew. Maybe I ought to forget the whole thing. There's so much I'll never be able to understand or visualize. I mean, reality is too complex for comics. So much has to be left out and distorted. And his partner just says, keep it honest, right? See what I mean? Realize you'd never let me talk this long without interrupting. So what Mouse gives us is a biographical, documentary focus in comics that really kind of runs through to Persepolis, to Fun Home, to American Born Chinese, to Displacement, to Joe Sacco's Palestine, many, many other comics. So I hope this video contextualizes a bit of the development of comics and also gives you some more things to read and some things to think about as we transition to the second unit in our class called After Mouse. So we'll talk more about that next week. Have a real nice weekend. Talk to you soon.